Why did Stalin trust Hitler? Everyone knows the story. Stalin was caught off guard. Hitler attacked. The Soviet Union nearly collapsed. That's the version in every textbook, every documentary, every classroom. But here's what nobody tells you. Stalin wasn't caught off guard because he lacked information. He had the information. All of it. Dates, troop numbers, locations. The hidden truth is far more disturbing. He chose to ignore it. And understanding why he made that choice will completely change how you see not just this moment in history, but how catastrophic decisions actually happen at the highest levels of power. By the end of this video, you'll know 3 things that most history channels never touch. What was genuinely running through Stalin's mind in the months before the 22nd of June 1941, why the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was never about peace. It was a calculated gamble that Stalin was certain he controlled, and how one man's unshakable belief in his own intelligence became the most lethal weapon Hitler never had to build. This isn't surface level. We're going inside the psychology, the intelligence failures, and the brutal strategic logic behind the worst miscalculation of the 20th century. Here's the real question nobody's asking properly. Did Stalin actually trust Hitler, or did he trust his own ability to read Hitler? Because those are 2 completely different things. And the hidden truth behind that distinction, that's what changes everything. The 23rd of August, 1939, 2 weeks before World War II officially begins, Ribbentrop flies into Moscow. Stalin and Molotov sit across the table from a representative of the regime that had been publicly calling for the destruction of Bolshevism for over a decade. They shake hands, they sign. The world cannot believe what it's seeing. Here's what the official story gets wrong, and this is the first hidden truth of this entire story. Stalin didn't sign that pact because he trusted Hitler. He signed it because he trusted Britain and France even less. At Munich in 1938, the Western powers handed Hitler the Sudetenland Czechoslovakia's industrial core without a fight, without consultation, without so much as a serious objection. Stalin watched that and reached a conclusion that felt completely rational. The West is trying to point Hitler east. They want Germany and the Soviet Union to destroy each other while they sit safe behind the English Channel. So Stalin made what he believed was the smarter play. He redirected the threat. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact came with a secret protocol. Poland divided, the Baltic states falling into the Soviet sphere, a physical buffer zone between German forces and Soviet territory. In Stalin's mind, he had just outmaneuvered everyone. As historian Robert Service noted, Stalin genuinely believed he was the master manipulator, not the one being manipulated. And that self-image, that iron conviction in his own strategic genius would quietly become the most dangerous thing in the room. Because Hitler wasn't playing the same game. Hitler had written in Mein Kampf in 1925, 14 years before that handshake in Moscow, that destroying the Soviet Union and seizing its land and resources was the core purpose of his entire political existence. Stalin had read Mein Kampf. He just decided Hitler didn't mean it literally. That single decision, dismissing the clearest statement of intent any leader had ever publicly committed to paper, is the foundation on which everything else collapses. But the story gets darker, much darker. And the next layer of hidden truth is the one that should genuinely disturb you. By early 1941, the intelligence coming into Moscow is not ambiguous. It is specific, it is sourced, and it is relentless. Richard Sorge, a Soviet spy working inside the German embassy in Tokyo, one of the most effective intelligence operatives of the entire war, sends a report in May 1941 stating that Germany will attack the Soviet Union around June 20th. The actual date was June 22nd, 2 days off. The man had the date. Stalin's handwritten response on that report: "This is a German provocation. Sorge is a liar and a fraud. Not investigate, not prepare." Dismissed. Winston Churchill, through ultra-intelligence intercepts of German communications, sends a direct warning to Moscow in April 1941. Stalin reads it, and his immediate interpretation is, Britain is trying to drag the Soviet Union into the war. This is manipulation. The man who was telling Stalin the truth got filtered out by Stalin's own paranoia before the truth could land. And then comes the part of this story that reveals something genuinely chilling about how power works. Soviet border commanders start reporting massive German buildups along the frontier tank formations. Supply lines, airfield construction, hundreds of thousands of troops visible to the naked eye. Those reports travel up the chain, senior officers know. But here is the hidden truth inside the Soviet system. Officers who pushed too hard for action started getting accused of spreading panic and defeatism. In Stalin's Soviet Union, delivering bad news aggressively enough could end your career or your life. So the system adapted. It learned not to push. The man at the top had built an environment where truth could not reach him with any force behind it. That is not just a historical footnote. That is a warning about every structure built on fear rather than honesty. So why didn't he mobilize? He had the intelligence. He had the warnings. He had eyewitness reports of the largest military buildup in European history sitting directly on his border. The hidden truth here runs 3 layers deep, and each layer feels logical right up until the moment it doesn't. Here's the first layer. Stalin genuinely believed Hitler would not open a two-front war. And this wasn't irrational. Germany was still fighting Britain. The Royal Navy controlled the seas. The Luftwaffe had failed to achieve air superiority in the Battle of Britain in 1940. Every serious military strategist at the time understood that attacking the Soviet Union before resolving the Western theater was a potentially fatal overextension. Napoleon had tried it. Napoleon had been destroyed by it. Stalin believed Hitler understood this. He believed Hitler was, at minimum, rational enough to avoid Napoleon's mistake. What Stalin could not model, and what German archives later confirmed, was that Hitler had reached the opposite conclusion through different logic. In Hitler's mind, destroying the Soviet Union quickly would eliminate Britain's last potential continental ally and force London to negotiate. It wasn't two-front thinking. It was sequential elimination thinking. Finish one before the other can react. Stalin's framework for reading Hitler's rationality was built on assumptions Hitler simply did not share. The second layer, Stalin believed the economic relationship between Germany and the Soviet Union created a mutual dependency that functioned as deterrence. After the pact, a trade agreement followed. The Soviets were shipping grain, oil, and raw materials west into Germany. Germany was sending industrial equipment and weapons technology east. Stalin told his inner circle in early 1941 that Germany needed Soviet resources too badly to risk destroying the source. What he failed to fully account for is that Hitler's ideology was never about buying resources. It was about taking them permanently. The trade deal was, from Hitler's perspective, simply logistical preparation for the seizure that was always coming. The third layer is the deepest one, and it's where the hidden truth becomes almost unbearable. Stalin kept insisting he needed more time to rearm, more time to modernize, more time to rebuild the officer corps of the Red Army. But here is what he never said out loud to anyone. The reason the officer corps needed rebuilding was because he had destroyed it. Between 1937 and 1938. Stalin's political purges had executed or imprisoned approximately 35,000 Red Army officers, including 3 of his 5 marshals and 13 of his 15 army commanders. He had surgically removed the professional military leadership of the Soviet Union in a fit of political paranoia. And then he needed time, desperately needed time, to reconstruct what his own fear had dismantled. The man who needed more time to prepare had personally ensured that preparation would take longer. That tragic loop closes on itself in a way that is almost impossible to look at directly. The 22nd of June 1941, 3:15 inches the morning. 3.5 million German soldiers cross into Soviet territory simultaneously, the largest military invasion in the history of warfare. Within hours, the Soviet Air Force loses over 1,200 aircraft. Most of them are destroyed on the ground, never having taken off. And then something happens that the official Soviet history buried for decades. Stalin goes silent. For nearly 2 weeks, one of the most ruthless and operationally decisive political leaders of the 20th century essentially withdraws from command. People in his inner circle describe him as unreachable. Not panicked in the way you might expect, but something closer to a man whose internal operating system has encountered something it cannot process and simply stopped. Georgy Zhukov, the general who would eventually lead the Soviet counteroffensive that turned the entire war, described walking into Stalin's office to deliver news of the invasion and finding a man who looked like his. Entire conception of reality had been deleted in real time. Here is the hidden truth of that moment. Stalin wasn't frozen because the attack was unexpected in the abstract. He was frozen because every layer of logic he had used to reassure himself, the two-front calculation, the economic interdependence, his own ability to manage the timeline, had collapsed simultaneously. It wasn't just a military surprise. It was a total failure of his internal model of how the world worked. And when that happens to any person, when reality doesn't just challenge your beliefs, but destroys the entire framework holding them together, the mind does not always respond with action. Sometimes it just stops. Stalin eventually came back. He rebuilt. He led the Soviet Union through one of the most brutal reversals in military history. But the cost of those first weeks, measured in territory lost, soldiers captured, and lives ended, was staggering. Historian David Glantz estimated that in the first 6 months of Operation Barbarossa alone, the Soviet Union suffered roughly 4.5 million military casualties. That number is the arithmetic of one man's psychological blind spots, written in human beings. So here is the hidden truth that sits underneath all of it, the one that makes this story matter beyond 1941. The failure was not a failure of intelligence. Stalin had the intelligence. The failure was a failure of mental model. He had constructed a picture of reality that had its own internal consistency, its own evidence, its own narrative logic. And when information arrived that contradicted that picture, his mind did not update the model. It found reasons to reject the information instead. Richard Sorge wasn't a brilliant spy delivering a precise warning. He was a liar and a prostitute. Churchill wasn't an ally trying to prevent catastrophe. He was a manipulator trying to engineer a war. The border commanders weren't reporting a real buildup. They were spreading panic. Psychologists call this belief perseverance. Once a person, especially a highly intelligent person with deep ego investment in their own strategic judgment, has committed to a framework, disconfirming evidence doesn't change the belief. It activates defensive reasoning. And the more intelligent the person, often, the more sophisticated and convincing the rationalization becomes. George Santayana warned that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. But Stalin's case reveals something even more unsettling. Sometimes people remember the past clearly, apply it logically, and still arrive at catastrophic conclusions because the past they're drawing from doesn't actually map onto the present reality. Hitler wasn't Napoleon 1941, wasn't 1812. And Stalin's mental model, no matter how internally coherent, was processing the wrong inputs. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact wasn't naive. The trade logic wasn't naive. The strategic framework wasn't naive. What was fatally, catastrophically naive was believing that a man who had written his intentions explicitly, demonstrated them repeatedly, and was at that very moment moving millions of soldiers to your border, was doing it for any reason other than the one he had always openly stated. The real question was never, why did Stalin trust Hitler? The hidden truth, the one this entire story has been building toward, is this. Stalin never trusted Hitler. He trusted himself. He trusted his own ability to read Hitler, to manage Hitler, to outthink Hitler. And that trust in himself, in his own model of reality, cost more lives than almost any single decision in the history of the modern world. Which means the lesson isn't about Stalin. It's about what happens when anyone in any position, in any era, trusts their internal model of reality more than the evidence standing directly in front of them. If something in this video hit differently for you, if there was a moment where the story shifted how you think about intelligence, power, or how catastrophic decisions actually happen, drop it in the comments. I read all of them. And if you want to keep going deeper into the real mechanics behind the decisions that shape the world we're living in, not the cleaned up version, the actual underneath, subscribe to Telerix. Because what's coming next goes even further. And you don't want to walk into it without the context we just built together.